Thank you, everyone. We will get started. Thank you to those of you in the room. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and a very warm welcome to our live stream viewers who are joining us today for our event on tackling Australia's housing crisis. For those of you on the live stream, I'm Cassandra Windsor, Chief Economist of CEDA, and very pleased to welcome you here. I would now like to hand over to Janelle Hopkins, Chief Financial Officer at REA Group, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Warm welcome to everyone in the room and everyone joining us on live stream. My name is Janelle Hopkins. I am the CFO of REA Group. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to thank CEDA for bringing us together to further the discussion and heighten the focus on solving Australia's housing crisis. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from the Housing Minister shortly, so to help set the scene, I'm going to provide a brief snapshot of the property market through REA Group's unique lens. Most of you will be familiar with our flagship brand, Australia's leading residential property site, realestate.com.au. We connect the 10 million property seekers who visit realestate.com.au every month with real estate professionals around the country. We also operate a share accommodation platform, Flatmates, which is very popular at the moment considering the housing crisis, a mortgage broking brand, Mortgage Choice, and our data business, PropTrack. Our purpose is to change the way the world experiences property. So needless to say, we have a very strong affinity with today's topic. Home ownership has long been a cornerstone of the great Australian dream. Yet over recent years, affordability has deteriorated to levels not seen before. Higher interest rates, greater construction costs, and increasing home prices mean the disparity between those that own homes and those that don't continues to grow. PropTrack's latest Housing Affordability Index demonstrates how pervasive the problem of affordability and accessibility is, with first home buyers disproportionately affected by the current market conditions. To illustrate this shift, a typical income household earning $105,000 per year could afford to buy around 40% of homes in 20 and 21. Today, at current interest rates, they could afford just 13% of homes. At the same time, rental vacancy rate has hit a record low of 1.06%. Declining vacancy rates increase competition for rentals and places substantial growing pressure around rents. The rental market directly affects around half of Australian households. 30% rent and 20% own homes they don't live in. Currently, investors selling rental properties account for about 25% of all home sales, while fewer new investors are taking their place. Rental properties entering the market is running around 9%. Current market conditions point to an outlook that remains extremely challenged. This will affect many Australians, but impact mostly those disadvantaged and financially vulnerable Australians the most. This is why the discussion we're having is so important. We need solutions to the systemic issues we face in the short, medium and long term. I do want to acknowledge the decisive steps from the federal government to support new supply with their flagship $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. They've shown a genuine willingness to understand and address the problem. Positively, the National Housing Accord sets out how all three levels of government, institutional investors and the construction sector will work together. To achieve sufficient supply for Australia's forecast population growth, absolutely more needs to be done. Ongoing reforms are necessary to encourage investment and support fast and effective development. We need to streamline planning to fast-track more medium-density housing. Levers such as taxation are also important. Stamp duty in particular is ripe for reform. Momentum for change is growing rapidly, and now is the time for all levels of government and the private sector to unite and to act. Minister Collins said last year she sees solving Australia's worsening housing crisis as not only her job, but something of a personal mission to make things right. So I'd now like to invite the Honourable Julie Collins MP, Federal Minister for Housing, Minister for Homelessness and Minister for Small Business to the stage. I look forward to hearing more on the steps the federal government is taking to ensure better housing outcomes for all Australians. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Janelle, and can I also thank CEDA and the sponsors for today. I too want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we meet today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people who are with us in the room. I also want to reiterate the Albanese Labor government's commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice to Parliament. Displayed at the entrance to my office in Parliament House is a piece of artwork that I received from the Catherine Accommodation Action Group just a few weeks after I became the Minister for Housing. This artwork includes personal accounts of housing insecurity from across Catherine, highlighting the unacceptable consequences of Australia's housing challenges. At the centre of the artwork is a simple but important message: waiting too long. These 3 words are driving me every day to improve the housing situation for more Australians. And it's why our government has identified housing as a key policy area for the Voice that it could focus on so we can deliver real improvements for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the shocking statistics on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing highlight why these improvements are so needed. On the night of the 2021 census, 24,930 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were homeless. That means 1 in 5, or 20%, of people experiencing homelessness in Australia identified as First Nations Australians. 1 in 5. In the 2021-22 AIHW Specialist Homelessness Report, around 28% of all specialist homelessness services clients were First Nations clients. We clearly have so much work still to do, but I believe the Voice will be a critical step forward to help properly address these tragic figures, because there are people behind these figures. And it's one of the reasons that I'll be voting yes this Saturday. It's terrific to be back at CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Last time I did address them, it was quite some time ago looking back. I was the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Women back then, and briefly the Minister for Housing. But I do want to thank them for hosting today's event. As we've heard from Janelle, challenges are right across the housing spectrum in Australia today. We know that there are too many Australians experiencing homelessness. The total on that census night was 122,000 Australians in 2021. We also know that we're lagging behind and there hasn't been enough investment in community or social housing. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare says the population of households living in social housing declined from 4.8% of our population to 4.1% in the decade from 2011 to 2022. We know more people are dealing with rental stress. Nearly half, or 46.7% of low-income earners who rent now spend more than 30% of their weekly income on housing. And then there are decades of falling home ownership rates for younger Australians. The intergenerational report said for those aged 30 to 34, home ownership fell by a staggering 18 percentage points from 1981 to 2021. We cannot afford to leave any of these challenges in the too hard basket. So, as a responsible and practical government, we're facing these challenges head on. We have a federal government stepping up to the plate again. And today I want to focus on how we're going about this work right across the entire housing system. Our agenda represents one of the most comprehensive sets of national housing policy reform in decades. It includes investing around $9.5 billion in our first year in government to help Australians access safe and affordable housing. I've also been very clear as Housing Minister, this is not something we can do alone. No tier of government can. No tier of government controls all the policy levers. Likewise, our nation's housing challenges are such that government and governments can't solve them all on their own. It will take the combined effort and coordinated efforts of public, private and community sectors all working together over years to undo the decades of declining affordability. The investment community, the not-for-profit sector, all bring different strengths to this. Our lending institutions, institutional investment, the property and construction industries also have significant roles to play. Partnerships underpin every aspect of our agenda. Community housing is a prime example. I often get the privilege of attending community housing events that the federal government has contributed via the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, known as NHFIC. Tomorrow, you'll all be pleased to know, will be known as Housing Australia, which is much easier for all of us to say. Getting the opportunity to meet tenants who are starting a new chapter in their lives is always a great highlight. But it's also wonderful to meet the successful project partners on site. Behind every ribbon cutting and meeting new tenants, there's often a great team of people from the private sector, the community housing providers, multiple levels of government and other financiers. The community housing launch I attended across the bay at Brighton East, near where we're meeting today, was a great example of this. In July, the first tenants moved into the first 3 buildings set aside for people aged over 55. 36 new homes are now complete. Another 116 will soon be built on the same site. A project of this scale wouldn't be possible without the partnerships between the Australian Government, the Victorian Government and the community housing provider, Housing First. Housing First CEO summed it up by saying, together, government and community housing providers not only build homes, but build communities, support neighbourhoods and change lives. It brings home the reality that partnerships are fundamental to getting things done in housing, not just in individual projects, but we need them on a national scale. That's why we've already had 4 meetings with state and territory ministers and homelessness colleagues, housing and homelessness colleagues, to make sure that we are all working together. We're soon to have our 5th meeting in another month or so. When we came to government, housing ministers from across the country had not met for almost 5 years. It's a bit of a difference. It says a lot, I think, about the engagement by the former Australian government. Housing is not someone else's problem, it is everyone's problem. Partnerships are so critical to driving housing change, but they didn't even have a meeting for almost 5 years. We do not want to make these mistakes. We want to work together and build the stronger relationships with other tiers of government and the sector. And we're doing this through the crucial National Housing Accord, and it was great to hear Janelle talk about that and how we might use it. It was announced in our very first budget in October last year. The Accord brings together governments, investors and representatives from the building and construction sector with a shared ambition to increase housing supply. Through the National Housing Accord, we are setting ambitious housing supply targets. This is the first time that all jurisdictions have agreed to ambitious national housing targets since the post-war reconstruction in 1945. We're elected to government with an ambitious housing plan, and we make no apologies for adding to our agenda at every opportunity. It is becoming more ambitious, but it needs to be. The significant reforms that came out of the August meeting of National Cabinet this year in Brisbane are a case in point. National Cabinet agreed to a better deal for renters, working towards harmonisation and strengthening renters' rights across the country. This is significant because it comes at a time when more Australians are renting than ever before. It will be better for renters and better for landlords. National Cabinet also agreed to a national planning reform blueprint. This includes actions to unlock housing supply and improve affordability, to tackle things such as planning, zoning, land release and other reforms. National Cabinet also agreed to the new national target to build 1.2 million well-located homes over the 5 years from 1 July 2024 as part of the National Housing Accord and the National Cabinet Agreement. This is a new target that added to the million homes under the Housing Accord, so an additional 200,000 new homes above that Accord target agreed last year. We know this housing target will be incredibly ambitious, but it has to be. We have to add to supply. We hope we'll achieve the Accord's aspirations. We're not sitting back. We know incentives will be critical to help us meet these targets. The National Cabinet meeting also agreed that the Albanese Labor government would commit $3 billion in new performance-based funding under the New Homes Bonus. As the Prime Minister said, we're taking a leaf out of the playbook from successful competition reforms of the 1990s. we will be providing payments to state and territory governments to boost housing supply and increase housing affordability. The new homes bonus will pay state and territory governments for delivering more than their share of the 1 million well-located homes target under the Accord. There'll also be a $500 million housing support program to help local governments and state governments reach this ambitious housing target. This will be a grants program to help local and state governments kickstart housing in well-located areas. It will be able to fund things like connecting essential services, building amenities to support new housing developments. To say there's a need for a medium-density housing in an inner-city suburb, but you have to upgrade the supporting infrastructure. This program is about making sure we have the essential services, the community infrastructure, and the right planning capability to make it happen. We're also changing incentives in other ways. For example, in the last budget, we announced tax incentives to have more investment in build-to-rent projects. Build-to-rent is emerging as an asset class, but currently accounts for only 0.2% of the total housing stock in Australia. We have made changes to reduce the withholding tax rate for eligible fund payments from managed investment trusts attributed to newly constructed build-to-rent developments, and we're moving it from 30% to 15%. We're pleased that CEDA welcomed this decision in its recent Making Renting More Viable submission. We're also increasing the capital works tax deduction rate from 2.5% to 4% per year. What this means is that new build-to-rent developments can be depreciated over the 25 years rather than 40. We, of course, have our $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, which we finally got through the Parliament, and it's also a central part of our plan. It's a crucial part of meeting the aspirations of the National Housing Accord, and it's about ensuring there are more types of all homes, homes to buy, homes to rent, and more social and affordable homes. Through the Housing Australia Future Fund, the Albanese government will deliver the biggest single investment in social and affordable housing in more than a decade. This will help fund, in the first 5 years, 30,000 new social and affordable homes, including 4,000 homes for women and children impacted by family and domestic violence or older women at risk of homelessness. We've structured the Housing Australia Future Fund in perpetuity so that disbursements can be made every year. This is critical because it provides certainty to the community housing sector and to state and territory governments, and also importantly investors, to know that this money will be available every year and support their ability to attract private capital, but also to plan and have a pipeline of continuous work, so there's less stop-start of social housing and affordable housing being built in the country. I welcome support for this fund from frontline organisations, housing experts, community housing providers, and indeed every state and territory housing minister has supported this fund. Because everybody knows that this secure ongoing pipeline of funding is critical. As part of the new Housing Accord, we also announced further funding from 1 July 2024 over 5 years for an additional 10,000 affordable rental homes for key workers in well-located areas. This commitment has been matched by states and territories who will build another 10,000 affordable rental homes. So the 30,000 from Housing Australia under the HAF, another 10,000 from the Accord, another 10,000 from the states and territories. We also need to provide long-term certainty, but we need to have the right architecture in place to deliver it. I keep mentioning Housing Australia and the name change. Housing Australia does do an outstanding job, and we've made several changes to widen its remit and to improve the tools available to it. We've broadened the scope of the National Housing Infrastructure Facility. We allowed up to $575 million of funds to be invested in social and affordable homes, and we did that last year. We have homes under construction today because we did that immediately. We've also announced recently that whilst we wait for the Housing Australia Future Fund to be invested and make returns, we'll be putting an additional $1 billion this financial year into the National Housing Infrastructure Facility to support more social housing, to get those homes on the ground faster. We also increased Housing Australia's liability cap by a further $2 billion to $7.5 billion to provide low-cost and longer-term financing to community housing providers through the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator. And we've made Housing Australia the responsible agency for delivering the majority of the disbursements from the Housing Australia Future Fund. We've also made a series of appointments to boost the skills and the experience of the board, including the recent appointment of Carol Austin as chair, the appointments of Nigel Ray and the Honourable Richard Wynne from Victoria as board members. We've also, of course, as part of this package in the Parliament, passed legislation to establish the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. This council was a big step forward. Its independent and expert advice will play a pivotal role in shaping our housing reform agenda for years to come. As members appreciate, the council will provide strong evidence base to support government's decisions. We've had this interim council up and running since January this year until we could get the legislation through the Parliament to establish it permanently. I announced just yesterday that we hope to have that up and permanent by the end of the year. The interim council has been led by one of the most accomplished leaders in Australia's property sector, Susan Lloyd-Howitz, and she's done some terrific work already, her and the council delivering a report on barriers to institutional investment in housing that is already on the government's desk with recommendations, and we're addressing those and looking at those. It's clear from the Supply Council that institutional investors can and should play a greater role, and we need them, and we need to understand the barriers to them investing further. The report on barriers to institutional investment has 11 recommendations, and the recommendation seeks to ensure a pipeline of residential projects suitable for institutional investment. Again, there's that pipeline, less stop-start in the sector. Through the National Housing Accord and decisions taken by National Cabinet, we're well on the way to implementing some of the Council's recommendations. Earlier, I mentioned the agreement with the states and territories to establish the housing targets and for the government to provide incentives. That's one of the recommendations. We'll consider the rest of the recommendations carefully and consult with our key partners. I also plan to discuss the report importantly with state and territory colleagues at the next Ministerial Council meeting. We're also working with the state and territory governments to develop a long-term plan, the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. The plan is a major piece of work and another significant process for delivering certainty and a pipeline. The plan will be a 10-year strategy, outlining a shared vision across different levels of government to inform future housing and homelessness policy reforms required in the short term, the medium term, and importantly, the long term. The plan will help us better understand the drivers of homelessness and housing insecurity throughout urban, regional, rural and remote Australia. We've released an issues paper and we're formally commencing public consultations and stakeholder engagement. And we've been doing that right across the country. The consultation process is broad and includes submissions as well as a mix of online and face-to-face consultations across the country. Meaningful consultation is important to this, and I personally want to make sure that we also get involvement of people with lived experience. Submissions are currently open and close on the 20th of October, and face-to-face consultations will continue until early November. For those of you in the room who are interested and haven't yet, I urge you to go to the Department of Social Services Engage website and put in your submission or do the online survey. We do want to hear from as many people as possible and we want as many diverse opinions as possible as part of this consultation. It's only by emphasising the different voices that we will get better outcomes. We want to make sure, of course, that this plan has longevity and is accepted by as many in the community as possible. We believe this new architecture will be transformative for housing policy in Australia, but we know the housing challenges are immediate right now, which is why we have also taken that immediate action whilst implementing the broader reforms. Crucially, our $2 billion social housing accelerator that has already been provided to states and territories, it's already in their bank accounts. We've already delivered that funding and we've already made some announcements with the states and territories, but they must commit their funding or have expended it in contracts by the 30th of June 2025. So this money is with them and they need to get these houses on the ground. We've allowed them flexibility in how they permanently boost social housing stock under this accelerator program. They can include new builds, expanding existing programs, renovating or refurbishing existing uninhabitable stock. We've already seen announcements between the Prime Minister and the New South Wales Premier. Indeed, the Prime Minister recently announced a project that will see 196 outdated uninhabitable dwellings built in the 1960s, replaced with 231 modern energy-efficient homes for Victorians, increasing housing on the site by 10%. So we're doing this right across the country, and yesterday I announced in Queensland their funding will provide another 600 social homes in Queensland. We've moved to ease pressure on renters immediately by increasing the Commonwealth rent assistance. We know that rental stress has been elevated across the country, not to mention other cost of living pressures. So on the 20th of September, the government increased the Commonwealth rent assistance by 15% for the maximum rate. This is the largest increase in the CRA in more than 30 years. This will help many renters keep pace with strong rental growth and will help them with their cost of living. When it comes to tackling homelessness, we also provided an extension to the current agreement with states and territories, the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, $1.7 billion for 1 year that we've provided to the states and territories. This was boosted with an additional $67.5 million in funding to tackle homelessness on top of, as part of that funding. The agreement will also provide around $128 million of dedicated homelessness funding for the states and territories, which they need to match. We, of course, have also expanded our home guarantee scheme, which is already helping thousands of Australians into private home ownership. Since the election, more than 70,000 Australians have been helped into home ownership under this scheme, including more than 10,000 through the new regional first home buyer guarantee that we introduced early. One of the stories that stands out for me in the regional first home buyer guarantee was a parent of two who secured a home. She said, and I want to quote this, "Being able to buy a home not only provides me and my children stability, security and safety, but an overwhelming sense of pride and self-worth. We want more people to be able to have that safety and security and own their own home." We've made a series of changes to expand the scheme's eligibility criteria. So it's now available to single legal guardians of children, not just parents. Siblings, friends, family members, all who are eligible borrowers can join together, not just de facto couples or married couples. We've also, for the first time, opened the door to both guarantees to non-first home buyers who have not held a property in Australia within the past decade. These are people who got shut out of the market who want to get back in and are in a position to do so. At the same time, we're also working to help deliver our Help to Buy scheme, our shared equity scheme. This scheme will support 40,000 low-income and middle-income Australians to purchase a home of their own. And this will be a shared equity scheme. This will provide lasting relief for participants, and that 40,000 is over the 4 years. Critically, of course, it also helps with the rental sector because it'll be a lifeline for renters or people that can service a rent who have lost hope of achieving the Australian dream of home ownership. It was agreed at National Cabinet, that same National Cabinet in August, that all states will progress legislation so we can run this scheme nationally next year. So as you can see, we're using a combination of policy levers to address the housing challenges we have today. It was never going to be easy. We're working across 8 different jurisdictions with the states and territories and, of course, local government. But we're moving in the country's best interests. We're building stronger partnerships with the states and territories, not just between governments, but also importantly with the industry and with the sector. We're setting ambitious targets. We want to be ambitious. We're backing that up with incentives to help us get there, and we're shifting all the levers that we have before us to provide long-term certainty and balancing that by addressing the immediate challenges. We've set up the institutions to provide expertise to keep things moving in the right direction. There are actions required to improve outcomes for renters, new buyers, mortgage holders, and those experiencing homelessness. Right across the housing spectrum, we're acting. I'm proud of what we've been able to do in just a short period of time. But I want to thank CEDA for recognising the importance of housing in our economy, in our society, and improving the standard of living for all Australians. We'll keep working hard every day so that more Australians have a safe, affordable place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those fabulous remarks. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Luke Houghton, and I'm the Global Leader for Infrastructure and Capital Projects for Deloitte. And it's my pleasure to spend time with the Minister here and ask some questions. I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to say that the Minister made a number of remarks reflecting the scope of the challenges facing Australia in regard to housing, and there is no question about the severity of the state of housing shortage, which has been largely due to years of undersupply, aggravated growth in demand and neglect. I was particularly struck by the Minister's comments in a number of areas. I think it was clear to all of us her personal passion and commitment to her portfolio and the issues of disparity for Indigenous Australians was very clear in what she had said. The Housing Accord represents a real change for the housing industry here in Australia. And excitingly, it wasn't just simply an admiration of the problems that exist, but also some detailed examples of what can be done. Things like the $9.5 billion investment in safe and affordable housing. A coordinated approach is not just a nice to have, but it is essential. We must do this in partnership. And there is also a targeted set of incentives that are being launched to help support that. Through the National Housing Accord, the Commonwealth Government and the state and territory governments are moving to deliver 1.2 million new, well-located homes over 5 years, commencing from next year. And that national housing target translates to 60,000 dwellings per quarter over 5 years, or 20 consecutive quarters in a row, which is quite a formidable target. Our estimates suggest that factoring in construction time and project delays, dwelling completions at the moment are targeting about 188,000 in dwellings in 2024 and about 184,000 in 2025, ready for people to move in. So that's a bit short of the target which has been set. So in that context, the environment is ripe for partnership and reform. The target can't be met unless there is a significant step change to the way that housing is planned and delivered, and we heard a lot about that. Without that change in the way we approach the national target, there's a risk of uncoordinated and, of course, piecemeal delivery, which will impact housing quality, quantity and outcomes for people most in need. And like you, Minister, we at Deloitte believe that to address these issues, a more integrated and ambitious approach is needed. Applying systems thinking provides the ability to design, link and coordinate initiatives across the country and across industry. And a shift in perspective is critically needed, and it must start with putting people's needs at the centre and treating houses as homes. And on that note, I would like to proudly say that tomorrow we are launching a paper that explores these issues and offers some potential interventions. And we'll be able to share some information with you in the follow-up links, and it will be available on our website. Now to the part that you've been waiting for, questions and answers. We will be throwing to the floor shortly. I would just encourage people to direct questions towards the Minister's portfolio. There are obviously areas where she is best placed to answer those. Of course, you will have the microphone, so ask what you will, but please respect the Minister's portfolio. There's been some questions coming in, and one that has received a lot of votes, Minister, is how will migration be factored into housing policy, and what steps will the government take to include migration data in forward planning?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we obviously get this quite a lot. Myself and Minister Claire O'Neill have had quite a few discussions, and Minister Claire O'Neill did a presentation about some of the review of the migration system that she's undertaking at the Press Club, and got the same question about housing. And we've been pretty upfront that, that's why we've moved our ambitious targets, from the 1 million to the 1.2, dealing with the demographic change in Australia. What we want to do, of course, is make sure that we have more homes. Supply has been an issue, but it was an issue before the pandemic and before where we are today. I mean, Australia has less homes per 1,000 people than the OECD average, so this has been a problem for some time. It has not been caused by the current migration issue. It has been there for a long time. We know that the answer is more supply. That's why the new homes bonus and the incentives for the states and territories and the agreement to do some of that planning and zoning reforms that the states are looking at will be critical to make sure we get there. I also think that what will be important is, as we were talking about earlier, is about innovation in construction. about, looking at other ways of constructing homes, dealing with some of the labour shortages and some of the supply chain issues that we have, whether that be modular homes. We went this morning and had a look at 3D printing and what that might be able to achieve. But we certainly need to look at every opportunity, every innovation possible to get as many homes on the ground as quickly as we can, but they need to be the right homes in the right places, and they need to be, appropriate, secure homes for people.
Thank you. I think it's a really important wording in the Accord where you're saying homes in the right locations. So often we can focus on building things, but if we don't get them in the right spot, they're not meeting the need. In that vein, there's obviously been a lot of talk about urban areas and housing, but turning to rural and regional housing delivery and access to affordable infrastructure, power and water. How is the government helping to support those initiatives to make sure that we can deliver housing in regional and rural areas?
Obviously, a critical part of the new homes bonus that I mentioned, you would have heard me talk about, is the $3 billion is the incentive for the states and territories that overshoot their target. So we're currently in the process of negotiating with the states and territories a partnership agreement. That will have a target, and what will happen is that target will equal 1 million homes across the country. For every home over that, each state and territory will receive a $15,000 bonus. And the pool at the end is the $3 billion. Obviously, only those jurisdictions which overshoot their target will access the $3 billion. So one state, in theory, could end up with the whole bucket. So it's a bit of competition between the states and territories to get there and do the reforms necessary too. So that'll help. The other thing's that $500 million fund that local government and state governments will be able to access for things like supporting some of that infrastructure planners, better planning, and look again at some of the innovations and the different ways that they can work with local governments, particularly in regional and remote areas, about providing support and getting through some of the systems. I was talking yesterday to some of the builders about some of the backlog and the lack of planners, for instance, in some of the rural and regional councils, and about whether or not the states could do something with some of the funding to try and resolve that, or whether the councils directly could. So we're working together. Minister Catherine King, who's the Minister for Infrastructure, and myself are looking at how we best use that $500 million, and that will be available pretty quickly for those areas to start progress on that quickly.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a question from the floor.
Hi, Alan.
Minister, well, thank you for that very comprehensive talk. I wanted to ask you, naturally, about mental illness, which I know you've had a policy interest in, and its connection with housing. The recent Productivity Commission report on mental health stressed the great importance of it and made some recommendations. The Victorian Royal Commission made a similar emphasis and made recommendations state and federal. The Victorian government has made an explicit stated top priority of putting people with mental illness in the top list of priority people, and the Minns government has also recently done some things in mental health housing space. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on how to take forward this not very heavily discussed matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan, and I know your passion in this area too, and some of the important work that you've done in the past, and clearly people living with mental health and mental illness, one of the critical areas for them is secure, safe, affordable accommodation to help them, in terms of their treatment plans getting better and actually contributing to our community and to society. So we do need to do better. In terms of priority cohorts and vulnerable people, we certainly, through the Housing Australia Future Fund and through Housing Australia and the investment mandate that we provide to them, want them to focus on the most vulnerable cohorts. What we don't want to do, though, is to stipulate what vulnerability people must have in order. What we want is them to focus on the most vulnerable people and to get them housed as quickly as we can, and we're working with the states and territories around that. the social housing waiting list is, around 200,000. So there's a lot of people in Australia that need housing and need it urgently. So we've got a lot of work to do, which is part of what providing that $2 billion immediately to the states and territories is all about. As I said yesterday, we announced with the Queensland Government this will mean another 600 social homes in Queensland that can be built over the next 2 years. So, that is important. The other thing that was important about the announcement in Queensland yesterday, and critically, is that 80% of those homes will be outside Brisbane. So they are for people in the outer suburban, regional cities and remote towns. So we're trying to, right across the country, provide that housing as urgently as we can to all the vulnerable cohorts. We also know, of course, that without it, people living with mental illness and mental ill health will not, in some cases, be able to get better until they have that secure housing because they're unable to get the treatment they need in many cases.
Thank you, Minister. In talking about the different cohorts, one of the questions that's coming through is that young care leavers are overrepresented in homelessness services, and appropriate housing options with wraparound supports can help break the cycle. What policies and approaches can we take to do this?
Yeah, well, that's what about increasing some of the homelessness funding was about. It was about providing more of those wraparound services and for the people who are homeless immediately. We know that the states and territories do invest in those services. We also know that in terms of, I suppose, the social licence of putting more social and affordable homes in every suburb right across the country, we're going to need to make sure that the tenancies are well maintained and people have the supports they need. So that will be a critical part of that discussion, and which is why we did the 1 year extension immediately for the states and territories. Obviously, we came to office last year in May, and the states and territories had no certainty of funding for the next year in terms of the next housing and homelessness agreement. So we extended it for the 1 year while we work on a new agreement. And what we want is that new agreement to line up with the Housing and Homelessness Plan and with the National Housing Accord, so that all three of them are heading in the same direction and they're not piecemeal. We want it all to work together seamlessly as much as we can.
Thank you. You talked there about some short-term and some longer-term solutions. So how do you balance responding to the short-term crisis while trying to implement longer-term reforms?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But, governments can chew gum and walk at the same time. And I think we've proven that we can do that in, our immediate response, unlocking that 575, giving the states the money, making some practical changes to try and change some of the long-term outcomes with the build-to-rent changes, the immediate increase in the Commonwealth rent assistance. Our first budget with the Accord, which is more longer term, while we did some of that short-term stuff. And then obviously the National Cabinet meeting, is again with the new homes bonus and the 5-year target, again long-term, but immediate action with money to try and facilitate the changes that are required. So we are obviously trying to do short-term, medium-term and long-term all at once. But I absolutely think it's necessary. I mean, everybody says, your housing agenda is really ambitious, and I use that word a lot. But it absolutely needs to be, and I'd rather be incredibly ambitious and go close than to have no ambition at all. And I think this country needs ambition in our housing agenda and policy to turn it around. Certainly in talking to my state and territory colleagues, they're all very passionate. I mean, this is a very big issue for them. I think they wouldn't mind me saying, that what we've seen is, not a focus like we've seen in the last few years. I certainly think that governments of various persuasions at levels of government across the country didn't have the focus that was necessary. I mean, last time we were in government, we had a focus of stimulus and housing and obviously on rents, but we weren't there for long enough, in my view, to turn some of the challenges around. And, what we've seen, I think, since is the foot taken off the pedal. And, the former government did say that, housing really is a state and territory responsibility. What we're saying is we all have some levers, we all need to work together, and whilst the federal government might not be constitutionally responsible, this is Australians, it's for Australians. These are people who live in our country, and we can and we should do better.
So, building on that theme of state responsibilities, clearly one of the issues that's talked about a great deal in housing is stamp duty and the state's issue. What can the federal government do to help impact stamp duty and some of those impediments for entry into the housing market?
Well, we've seen, one jurisdiction, one territory already make some changes with the ACT there. I mean, we don't want to dictate to states exactly how they do things, they have autonomy. And that's why the new homes bonus, what we've done is said, we want you to look at all of these things, but we're going to put this competitive bucket of funding here. How you get there is really up to you, but we want you to do the work locally. Because each jurisdiction has different needs and different responses are going to be needed. We absolutely get that in the autonomy of the state governments, and we saw, I think, during the pandemic just how much autonomy they can have. But we want them to use it here for the greater good, and that's why we're incentivising them as well as working with them.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about affordable and well-located homes. One of the questions that's coming through quite strongly is how are we defining affordable and well-located homes?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we get this a lot. So we're working with the community housing providers about what is, a definition of affordable housing. There isn't one agreed definition in Australia, and there are some legal issues across different registrations of different community housing providers, so we need to work our way through that, but we're getting there. But essentially we're looking at, with the National Housing Accord, I think we're talking about 25% below market rate for rental affordability.
Thank you. So a slightly tougher question from the crowd. 1.2 million homes is a great goal, but that is a rate of construction never achieved, and at a time borrowing costs are the highest in a decade and there are trade shortages. Can this be achieved given these issues?
Well, we wouldn't have set a target if we didn't think we were ever going to get there. We have spoken to the construction sector. They're suggesting that closer towards the end of this year, early next year, they'll have some capacity as supplies come online in terms of some of the current delays that they've had to construction. So we want to fill that with more social and affordable homes. We obviously also are doing work around Jobs and Skills Australia and the skill shortages with our fee-free TAFE, our additional university places. We're also doing some work in the industry portfolio with Minister Houghton and the National Reconstruction Fund to, increase supplies that are necessary. For instance, things like double glazed windows and, ramping up production of those and manufacturing of those in Australia so that we can deal with some of those. As I said earlier, we're also looking at other innovative ways of construction, things like modular homes, things like 3D printing. We don't want anything off the table. We want to be as innovative as we can, but we do need the homes, as I keep saying, to be the right homes in the right places. We want high standard quality homes for people. Under Housing Australia, all of the homes built will be silver access for people living with disability or mobility issues. So they'll also be under the National Construction Code level. So I think in most states that'll be around 7 stars. So in terms of energy efficiency.
Fantastic. And one final question which could well apply to a number of people in the room, but how can we make better use of our large houses? Can we and should we encourage more house sharing or renting of spare rooms?
That is a very good question, and it's one that gets raised with us a lot. I don't know how much people would actually do this and how comfortable some people would be and what role government should play in trying to match people up to live in other people's homes. I think there could be a few liability issues there about what that might look like. I know some of the community housing providers are looking at, again, innovative ways that they may be able to do that. Cooperative housing is also something I think that states and territories are doing a bit more work on, about co-ops and how we can get them to work better, and maybe some changes to tenancy laws that may be required to do that. So I think we should be looking at, as I said, we shouldn't be ruling anything out, but we should be looking at everything carefully. And one of the other important things, of course, is the data and the evidence around what will work and make a meaningful difference. I mean, I get a lot of questions about, apparently there's 1 million homes vacant in Australia, but by the time you look at the turnover, by the time you look at people with holiday homes, by the time it's actually probably around 30% of those homes are actually really vacant. So, what do we do with those? Some of the states are looking at various incentives or disincentives around those. Some of the states and all of the states have agreed to look at the impact of short-term accommodation, because there's certainly data and evidence that in tight rental markets that is having an impact. Certainly I know in my home state and my home city of Hobart it's having and had a terrible impact on rental affordability. So there are, lots of levers at various levels of government that can be pulled similar to that. And it's about making sure that we have the data and the evidence around those levers and about what they'll do right across the housing spectrum, because sometimes you can tweak a little bit over here and have an unintended consequence somewhere else. So we are mindful of that too, and making sure that we have data and evidence. That doesn't mean that we won't be brave and try new things, but being brave and trying new things means that sometimes they might not work as well as we intend, and we might have to tweak them or change them.
Well, thank you, Minister. That's all the time we have for questions. I would like to invite Natalie Kwok to the stage to do a formal thank you, but thank you for your honest and frank answers.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Luke. My name is Natalie Kwok. I'm the Chief Investment Officer and General Counsel at Ingenia. Thank you, Minister, for the engaging discussion and stepping us through the government's commitment to ambitious housing targets, progress made, and what's to come. It's pleasing to hear the federal government's multi-pronged approach to tackling homelessness, affordability, and availability, which recognises the need for governments at all levels to work with and partner with institutional capital, commercial developers, and housing providers to deliver sustainable, targeted housing supplies of different ownership models. Providing purpose-built, age and or place appropriate communities is certainly what we at Ingenia Communities are passionate about. We have land lease communities targeting over 55s for those looking to downsize or right-size. They typically sell out of their family home, unlocking the equity in their home to fund their retirement and also freeing up existing housing supply. We have senior rental villages that are really the original build-to-rent that were built 30 to 40 years ago. And typically they're smaller communities of 50 to 60 duplexes or townhouses, and tenants are typically on pension. Most of them have never owned a home in their life and have little or no super balance. They would have their home care package delivered to them by third parties to them at our community. And we also have holiday parks or caravan parks and those all-age rental communities that we run that have been converted from caravan or holiday parks. And they provide affordable rental accommodation to those where high-rise build-to-rent might not be suitable. A lot of our tenants are frontline workers, families, and also those who are in a vulnerable position who are just looking for safe, secure housing. These are not the traditional housing business models, and we see a real opportunity to work with the government and work with the industry collectively to continue to deliver these housing supplies and be part of the solution. And that's the key reason for us, for Ingenia, to sponsor this event and to participate and be part of the conversation. We look forward to further engaging with the government at all levels, hearing more about the Housing Accord and Housing Australia, and importantly, how state and local governments work with the federal government on housing planning rules, development and land use, because to achieve those ambitious targets, all levels of governments must align. It's my pleasure to formally thank you, Minister, for the very engaging discussion. Thank you, Luke Houghton from Deloitte, for facilitating. Thank you, Janelle, for the introductory remarks. Thank you, CEDA, for hosting the event. And I'll now formally pass on to Cassandra to close the event.
Thank you, and can I add my thanks to those of Natalie. Minister Collins, thank you so much for joining us today. Your support of CEDA is greatly appreciated. It's so great to see housing policy firmly back on the government agenda, and particularly that emphasis on collaboration and partnerships. This is not a problem that one group can solve alone. My thanks again to our sponsors today, Deloitte, Ingenia and REA Group, who've been engaging and contributing to our work and events through their sponsorship and more broadly. Without them, we couldn't put on these fantastic discussions. And thank you to everyone, both online and in the room, for joining in, for your active participation and all the fantastic questions that we got through on Pigeonhole. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation today and continue to engage with CEDA. We have a strong program of events coming up towards the end of the year, so it's going to be a busy few months for us. Particularly on the topic of today's discussion, we are going to be in Hobart in a couple of weeks' time, along a similar theme, talking about housing affordability and issues in Tasmania. So if any of you are in Hobart or your colleagues are there, please suggest to them that they get along to that one. And we also have Mapping the Energy Sector's Path to Net Zero coming up as well. So I hope to see some of you at upcoming events, but I also encourage you all to visit ceda.com.au to find out more about our event schedule and also our insights on economic and policy developments in Australia. Thank you all. Have a lovely afternoon.